"I've slept alone for 10 winters," Garrick Hale's voice rumbled from the shadowed doorway of his cabin, a voice low and rough like stone dragged across iron. "But tonight, you'll warm my cabin." Mara Ellison stopped short on the threshold, her breath steaming in the icy air, her shawl soaked and stiff from the storm that had nearly swallowed her on the ridge. Snow clung to her bonnet and lashes, her skirts heavy with frost, and the basket she carried slipped from her numb hands to thud against the wooden boards. She had walked for hours through the white fury, chasing the only thread of smoke rising against the iron sky, and now she had found not just a cabin, but a man whom the townsfolk had painted in both fear and awe. Garrick Hale stood tall within the doorway, his frame filling the logs behind him. Shoulders broad beneath a fur-lined coat that bore the scars of years of winter and war. His hair was long, dark, and tangled by wind, streaked with silver at the temples, his beard wild, his eyes a deep, unflinching black that caught hers and held her without mercy. He looked every inch the stories, a mountain giant who had refused hearth and company, who had lived through snows that buried cabins whole, who had taken wolf and elk with his bare hands when powder ran low. He was the man whispered about in town taverns, the one who had buried a wife long ago and vowed to bury his heart with her, the one who had turned his back on men and chosen stone and pine for his company. And yet here he was, offering her what no one else had dared, the warmth of his fire, the safety of his walls, the risk of his solitude breaking. Mara's lips parted. Trembling, but no sound came. The only voices were the storm raging behind her and the deep thunder of his words that refused to fade from her ears. She had expected to beg, to explain, to barter her way in with promises of work. But he spoke first, as if her coming had been foreseen, as if his long winters had carved a space only she could fill. Behind him, firelight flared golden, shadows stretching across the timber walls, a pot steaming faintly with broth, the wolf pelt draped across a chair like a throne awaiting its queen. The smell of wood smoke and pine pitch was intoxicating after hours of biting air, but the weight of his gaze was heavier still, pinning her between storm and man, between death by frost and life by fire. Garrick stepped forward into the light, and Mara saw more than the fearsome tales had told. She saw the hollows beneath his eyes, the lines of loneliness carved deeper than any scar, the weariness of a man who had endured silence too long. His voice dropped, softer, but it carried the weight of truth. "No one survives these mountains alone forever, not even me." The words struck her chest like a hand pressed against her racing heart, because in them was confession, plea, and command all at once. Mara's fingers clutched the edge of her shawl, her knuckles white, her lungs burning not from cold, but from the choice before her. She could step back into the storm and vanish like so many widows and wanderers before her, or she could cross this single threshold and bind herself to a man who had slept alone through 10 winters, but no longer wished to. The firelight flickered against his face. The wind shrieked outside, and Mara knew the night would decide whether she remained a wanderer or became the woman who would warm the cabin of Garrick Hale. Mara Ellison's body shook as though the storm still gripped her even inside the shelter of his doorway, the memory of hours trudging through the snow etched into her skin. She had not planned to come here, not truly, for every woman in the settlement whispered warnings about Garrick Hale, the man who had buried a wife and swore to bury his heart with her, the man who preferred wolves to neighbors, who let 10 winters pass without a single soul crossing his threshold. Yet when the storm came down from the peaks, like a beast unleashed, swallowing fences, burying roads, tearing roofs from weaker cabins, she had known her small shack would not hold. Her fire had gone to embers, her cupboards nearly bare, and with her childless widowhood there was no hand to share the work or guard the door. Desperation had driven her into the blinding snow with only a basket packed with the last of her bread and herbs, hoping against hope she might reach another settler's hearth. But all the nearer homes were shuttered tight against the gale, their lamps dark. She alone stumbled onward, following that thin curl of smoke until her legs nearly gave beneath her. And now she found herself at the mercy of the man no one dared approach. Garrick Hale did not step aside at once. He studied her, as though weighing the worth of letting her die outside against the risk of letting her live within. His eyes traveled over her sodden skirts, the frostbitten tips of her fingers, the weariness that dragged her shoulders down. Mara lifted her chin despite the tremor in her body, for though she was worn, she would not beg. "I had no place else," she whispered, her voice ragged, her lips raw from the wind. "If you turn me away, I will not see the dawn." For a long moment, silence stretched, broken only by the moan of the wind pressing against the walls. Then Garrick stepped aside, his broad frame parting like a gate, his voice still deep but quieter. "Then you'll see it here." She passed him, each step stiff as though her body had forgotten warmth, and the glow of his hearth washed her like a tide. She sank onto the bench near the fire, her fingers reaching out though she feared to be scolded for touching what was not hers. He shut the door with a thud that cut off the storm's scream, the sudden hush so complete she could hear her own heart pounding. Garrick hung his rifle back upon the wall, then moved to the hearth with the ease of a man who had lived too long in rhythm with silence. He ladled broth into a wooden bowl and set it before her. Mara's hands trembled as she lifted it, the steam burning her face but reviving her spirit. And when she dared glance at him again, she saw he was watching not with suspicion, but with something she had not expected. Hunger not of the body, but of the soul. She swallowed the broth and whispered, "Why me?" His gaze did not waver. "Because you came," he said simply, and his voice rumbled like the storm's answer. The broth warmed Mara's chest and spread through her limbs like fire kindled in frozen wood. Yet even as life crept back into her body, she could not still the tremor in her hands, for the cabin's silence pressed heavier than the storm outside. Garrick Hale sat across from her at the rough-hewn table, his elbows braced, his black eyes fixed upon her as though he studied not merely her face, but the soul behind it. His presence was overwhelming. The breadth of his chest beneath the fur coat, the raw power in his hands scarred from axe and rifle, the deep lines cut by weather and solitude. Yet there was no cruelty in him, only a weight that frightened her more than rage could, for here was a man carved by silence into stone, and she had stepped into the heart of it. She tried to fill the stillness with words, though her throat ached. "The storm tore the roofs from 2 houses in town. I thought mine would follow. I walked until I could no longer." Her voice trailed, ashamed of how quickly fear had driven her here. Garrick leaned back, shadows shifting over his face, his gaze never softening. "Town has roofs, neighbors, walls," he said flatly. "I have none of that. I have these mountains, and for 10 winters they've been enough." His hand moved then, slow to tug back the sleeve of his coat, revealing a scar, jagged and white, cutting from wrist to elbow. "A trapper's blade," he said, his voice low. "The winter after the war. I bled alone and lived alone. That was the bargain." He pulled the coat tighter again, his jaw hardening as if to close the door of his memory. Mara's eyes lingered on the scar, on the truth of his words. 10 winters, no company, no hand to bind wounds or share burdens. She thought of her own house, small and silent since her husband's fever had taken him. Of nights she whispered prayers to a God who gave no answer. Of mornings she had woken to frost crusting her blanket and no fire to greet her. She understood him more than she wished to admit. "And still," she whispered, forcing her voice through the silence, "you opened the door tonight." For a moment his eyes flickered, like a flame catching sudden wind. He rose without answer, crossing the cabin to lift the wolf pelt from its place by the fire. He draped it over her shoulders with a gentleness that startled her, the weight and warmth enveloping her like an embrace. His hand brushed her hair as he settled it, and she felt the roughness of his palm. The hesitance of a man who had forgotten how to touch another with kindness. When he stepped back, his voice rumbled low again, but softer than before. 10 winters is too long, even for stone. You came to my door, Mara Ellison. That makes you mine to keep alive." Her breath caught, her heart pounding not only from fear but from something stranger, a stirring she had not felt since her husband's death. And as the fire cracked, the silence stretched between them, heavy with promise and peril alike. The fire cracked in the stone hearth, its glow stretching shadows along the log walls like ghosts of years past, and Mara pulled the wolf pelt closer, the scent of pine and smoke clinging to it as though it had soaked in every storm Garrick Hale had weathered alone. He moved through the cabin with the slow precision of a man who had no need to hurry, setting tools back in place, tightening shutters against the wind, his every motion carved by habit. Yet as she watched him, Mara sensed more than strength. She saw the weight of silence that had pressed upon him through 10 winters, a burden no axe could split and no fire could burn away. His cabin was sturdy, walls stacked high with supplies, pelts hung thick as armor, rifles resting ready by the door, but it was the barrenness of a place built for survival, not for life. No laughter had filled these rooms, no second cup placed upon the table, no hand set upon his shoulder in the dim hours of night. It was a fortress, and it had become a prison. Mara's voice, tentative, reached through the hush. 10 winters is a long time, she murmured, her fingers brushing the rim of the wooden bowl he had given her. Garrick turned, his black eyes catching the firelight, the hollows beneath them deep. Long enough to forget the sound of a voice in the morning, long enough to stop setting a place at the table, long enough that a man begins to wonder if he is wolf or man. His words struck her chest like a stone, heavy with loneliness that matched her own, for she too had spent winters staring at empty walls, whispering prayers that faded into silence. She lowered her gaze. Remembering the fever that had stolen her husband, the neighbors who turned from her since, the weight of days without touch. "I know what it is to wake with no one there," she whispered. Garrick's jaw tightened, his gaze lingering on her face with something unreadable. "Then you know why I swore never to let another inside. The mountains take all who are weak. I thought I would not bear to watch it again." He moved closer, his boots heavy on the boards, until he stood above her, the fire behind him casting his frame into a looming silhouette. Yet when his hand lifted, it was not harsh. It brushed her hair back from her damp brow, the calloused fingers trembling as though uncertain of the right. "But you walked into my storm," he said, his voice roughened not with anger, but with something more dangerous. Need. Mara's breath hitched, her pulse pounding as she felt the closeness of a man who had locked himself away from the world and now stood on the edge of opening again. Her shawl slipped, the wolf pelt slipping lower until his hand caught it and pulled it back across her shoulders with a possessive care. "Tonight you will not sleep cold," he whispered. The fire roared, the wind battered the cabin walls, but inside, the silence that had ruled 10 winters shifted, bending toward something fierce and alive, something neither of them could yet name. The night deepened, the storm still clawing at the mountains, but the fire inside Garrick's cabin glowed steady, wrapping Mara in warmth that felt almost unreal after the hours she had spent stumbling through the frozen dark. She sat wrapped in the wolf pelt, her eyes tracing the scars in the logs, the rough-hewn shelves stacked with jars of dried berries, smoked meat, and herbs. Every corner of the room spoke of survival, yet none spoke of joy. Garrick moved with practiced ease, placing another log on the fire, his broad shoulders bending as though even the cabin's stout beams could barely contain him. Mara studied him, the silence between them heavy not with unease, but with the weight of unspoken truths, until a sound broke through the storm, sharp and foreign. The snap of a branch outside. Garrick froze. His hand went to the rifle on the wall, his eyes narrowing as he moved to the window and peered into the darkness beyond. Mara's breath caught, the memory of stories told in town surging back, trappers who prowled the high trails, stealing pelts and killing without mercy, men who had mocked Garrick as the wolf of the ridge for his solitude. Garrick's jaw hardened, and in that moment she saw not only a mountain man but a sentinel, every sense sharpened by years of living on the edge of danger. He turned back, his voice low. "We're not alone tonight." Mara gripped the edge of the bench, her heart pounding as the wind howled and another crunch of snow came closer, measured, deliberate. Garrick opened the door just a crack, his rifle leveled, the cold rushing in like a blade. Through the swirling snow, figures moved. 2 men. Their coats ragged, rifles slung across their backs, their eyes gleaming with hunger not for food, but for what could be taken. Garrick stepped fully into the doorway, his frame filling it like a barricade. "You're not welcome here," he growled. The taller of the 2 trappers sneered, his breath fogging the night air. "We heard you've got stores enough to last 3 winters, Hale. Maybe a woman now, too." His eyes flicked toward Mara, and Garrick's grip on the rifle tightened. "Leave her name out of your mouth," Garrick said, his voice a low thunder that rolled through the storm. The second man chuckled, but there was unease in it, for Garrick's presence was more formidable than the gale itself. "We only want to share your fire," the first lied, though his hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. Garrick stepped forward, forcing them back into the snow, his voice sharp as an axe. "My fire burns for those who earn it, not thieves, not carrion." Behind him, Mara rose, clutching the wolf pelt tighter, her fear battling with something fiercer. The realization that this man, who had lived alone for 10 winters, would stand as a wall between her and any who threatened. The trappers muttered, retreating into the storm with promises that hung like daggers in the air. Garrick shut the door and dropped the bar across it, his eyes finding hers. "These mountains take everything if you let them," he said softly. "But tonight, they'll take nothing from me." And as the firelight flickered across his face, Mara saw not only solitude, but a strength that made her feel, for the first time in months, that she was no longer alone in the fight to survive. The cabin stood still again, though the storm rattled against its beams, and the memory of the trapper's eyes lingered in the shadows. Garrick set his rifle back against the wall, his movements precise but heavy, each gesture carrying the weight of years lived on guard. Mara remained by the fire, clutching the wolf pelt around her shoulders, her body trembling not only from the cold, but from the echo of what she had just witnessed. The sudden ferocity in him, when strangers dared look her way, the raw power of a man who had survived 10 winters by keeping all others at bay. She had seen men stand tall in the town square, boasting of their rifles or their farms, but never had she felt such surety as when Garrick had filled the doorway, the storm at his back, and sent armed men into retreat. Yet behind that strength she sensed a cost. Something carved deeper than scars. She spoke softly, her voice fragile in the silence. "You've faced men like them before." Garrick paused, his broad shoulders stiffening, then turned toward her, his gaze dark and unflinching. "Every winter. Wolves wear hides of fur, and men wear coats, but they hunt the same. They see firelight, they smell meat, they take what isn't theirs. Out here, mercy gets you buried." He moved closer to the fire, sitting on the stool opposite her, the flames lighting the lines etched into his face. "The first winter alone, I thought I could still live as before. Share what I had, trust that neighbors meant what they said. I nearly starved when they left me with less than nothing. By the second, I learned." His hand brushed the scar along his forearm. And Mara realized it had not been wolf claw or accident that left the mark, but man's blade. "And the town?" she asked hesitantly. "Why not stay among them?" A bitter smile touched his mouth, but it did not reach his eyes. "Town talks, town judges. They say I let my wife die, that I chose the mountain over her. They'll never understand that the mountain was all I had left." His voice dropped, raw as the wind outside. "So I chose silence, silence and snow, easier to fight beasts than words that never die." Mara felt the ache of his solitude like a mirror to her own, the loneliness since her husband's fever, the way neighbors had turned pity into whispers that hollowed her out. She knew what it was to be blamed for surviving. She lifted her gaze, steady despite the tremor in her hands. 10 winters alone would break most men. "But you're still standing." Garrick leaned forward, his eyes catching hers across the fire. "Standing isn't living," he said. "I've been dead on my feet for years. Tonight I chose to open the door." The words hung between them, heavier than the storm, and Mara felt her breath catch at the confession. The man they called Wolf, the man who had buried himself in snow and stone, was revealing not just his past, but his hunger for more than fire, more than survival, for something only her presence could answer. The storm howled, but inside the cabin a different storm gathered, fierce and unspoken, and Mara knew the night was changing them both in ways neither could undo. The storm ebbed by dawn, its howls fading into a brittle silence that left the mountains cloaked in white. The trees bowed heavy under the weight of snow. Inside Garrick's cabin, the fire smoldered low, and Mara stirred beneath the wolf pelt, her body aching but alive, her eyes opening to the sight of Garrick crouched at the window, rifle in hand, every muscle taut. She rose quickly, fear prickling her skin, for the look on his face was not of a man greeting morning but of a hunter waiting for the next strike. "They've come back," he muttered, his voice low, as though speaking louder might summon danger closer. Mara crept to the window, her heart hammering, and through the frost-blurred glass she saw them. The 2 trappers from the night before, their coats dark against the snow, their boots crunching a slow path toward the cabin. One carried an axe across his shoulder, the other a musket, and their eyes were locked on Garrick's door as though it were prey cornered in the den. Garrick rose, towering, his jaw set, and he turned to her, his voice fierce but steady. "Stay behind me, no matter what." Mara's throat tightened, but she nodded, clutching the pelt tighter, as if it might shield her from what was to come. The trappers reached the steps, pounding fists against the wood, their voices sneering. "You've had your night, Hale. Open the door, or we'll take what's ours by fire." Garrick moved with sudden force, unbarring the door and flinging it wide, his rifle aimed square at their chests. The cold swept in like a knife, and the trappers froze, confronted by the sheer presence of the man who filled the doorway. You'll take nothing from me, Garrick growled, his voice rolling like thunder over the ridge. The taller trapper smirked, though unease flickered in his eyes. You think you can hold us both, Wolf? That woman doesn't belong to you, nor your stores. Everything here belongs to the strongest. He lunged, axe raised, and in an instant Garrick fired, the shot cracking through the morning, snow exploding as the ball struck inches from the man's boots. Silence followed, sharp and shattering, and the trappers staggered back, faces paling. The next shot finds its mark, Garrick warned, his eyes black as coal, his rifle steady. Leave while you still can. The smaller man cursed, gripping his companion's arm, and together they stumbled back into the snow, their threats trailing behind them like smoke. Garrick slammed the door shut, barring it once more. His chest heaving, though his hands did not shake. He turned, his gaze finding Mara where she stood pale and breathless by the hearth. For a long moment he said nothing, then crossed to her, placing the rifle aside. His hand reached out, rough and scarred, settling on her shoulder with a weight that was more vow than touch. They'll return again, he said softly. But so long as I stand, they'll never take you. Mara's eyes burned, not with fear, but with something fiercer, something she had not felt since her husband's passing, safety born of another's strength. She whispered, voice trembling, "And if you fall?" Garrick's gaze held hers, steady and unyielding. "Then I'll fall fighting to keep you warm." And in that moment, with the storm past but danger still circling, Mara understood that the bond forged in one night was stronger than the silence of 10 winters. The sun climbed pale and weak over the mountains, its light glinting off the drifts piled high against the cabin walls. But inside Garrick's home, the shadows of what had passed lingered like smoke after fire. Mara sat by the hearth, her hands clasped around a mug he had filled with steaming broth. Though she scarcely tasted it, her mind replaying the image of the trappers' faces, the malice in their eyes, the way Garrick had stood before them like a wall of stone. He moved about the room in silence, checking shutters, oiling the lock of his rifle, his every motion heavy with vigilance. Yet there was something else in his eyes now, a restlessness that was not born of fear, but of the presence of the woman who had crossed his threshold. When at last the chores were done, he sat across from her, the fire between them crackling, his dark gaze fixed. Mara felt her breath catch under the weight of it. "You shouldn't have come here," he said finally, his voice low, but there was no anger in it, only weariness. "These mountains are cruel enough without me dragging you into the wars I've fought alone." Mara swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I didn't come to be saved," she answered softly. "I came because there was nowhere else left. The town closed its doors to me. My house would have fallen in the storm. I walked because I had no choice." Garrick's jaw clenched, but his eyes softened as he leaned forward, the firelight glinting on the scar at his cheek. "No choice," he echoed, almost to himself. "That's what brought me here 2 years ago. No choice but to walk into the mountains and bury myself in silence. 10 winters I told myself I was safer that way. But last night—" He paused, his voice faltering, and Mara leaned closer despite herself, her heart pounding. "Last night, when you stood in my doorway, it was the first time in years I remembered what it felt like to want someone there." His words burned hotter than the fire, and Mara felt tears sting her eyes, though she did not let them fall. "And yet," she whispered, "you risk everything by keeping me here. Those men will return, others will too. Your silence is broken now." Garrick's hand lifted, rough and hesitant, crossing the fire's glow to brush against her cheek. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Maybe it's time it broke. Maybe it's time I remembered I'm still a man, not a ghost. Mara closed her eyes. Leaning into his palm, despite the fear curling in her chest, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt the warmth of another's touch, not born of pity but of fierce, living need. The wind moaned outside, rattling the shutters, but the silence in the cabin shifted into something new, heavy with confession and possibility. When she opened her eyes, Garrick's gaze held hers, unflinching. "If you stay, Mara, the mountains will test you," he said. "But I will stand with you. I swear it." Her breath trembled as she whispered back, "Then let the mountains come." And with that vow, spoken softly between them, the long shadow of 10 winters finally began to break. The wind had died by nightfall, leaving the mountains wrapped in an eerie silence, every sound carrying sharp across the snow. Mara sat near the fire, the wolf pelt drawn tight around her shoulders, but her eyes kept darting toward the barred door, every creak of the timbers setting her heart racing. Garrick Hale stood watch, as though he were carved from the logs themselves, rifle within reach, knife at his belt, his frame lit by the glow of the flames. Hours passed, the quiet almost unbearable, until it was shattered by the crunch of boots on snow, deliberate and close. Mara's breath caught. Garrick's hand closed around his rifle, his eyes narrowing. "They've returned," he said grimly. Voices followed, muffled but cruel, drifting through the walls. "You can't keep her, Hale. The cabin's not big enough for your pride and a woman's scream. Open the door or we'll set fire to it." Garrick's jaw tightened, rage flashing in his eyes. He moved to the window, pulling it open just enough to shout into the night. "You'll burn before my cabin does!" His words rolled into the darkness like thunder, but the trappers only laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Then came the strike of an axe against wood, the door shuddering as the bar strained under the blow. Mara cried out, clutching the pelt, and Garrick seized her arm, pulling her behind him. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice like iron. The door splintered again, the sound sharp as gunfire. Garrick raised his rifle and fired through the crack, the blast exploding into the night, and a scream followed, raw and startled. The door fell silent, the trappers retreating into the shadows. But Garrick knew it was not over. He turned. Eyes fierce. "They'll try the roof next." Even as he spoke, snow tumbled from above, heavy boots thudding against the beams. Garrick shoved Mara toward the hearth. "Do not move." He climbed the ladder to the loft with the strength of a man born for battle, bursting through the hatch into the night air. Mara heard the scuffle, the grunts of struggle, the clash of steel on steel. She pressed her hands to her mouth, terror clawing her chest as the fight raged above her, every blow echoing like thunder. Then came a final shout, a cry choked short, and silence fell. The hatch banged open, and Garrick descended, his coat torn, blood streaking his arm, but his eyes burning with victory. He dropped the broken knife of his enemy onto the floorboards. "They won't return," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. He leaned heavily against the wall, his chest heaving, and Mara ran to him, tears spilling as she caught his arm. "You're hurt," she cried, but he only shook his head, pulling her close with the strength that had not failed him yet. "I told you, as long as I stand, they'll never take you." And in that moment, with his blood warming her hands and his heart thundering against hers, Mara realized she no longer feared the mountains, for she had found a man willing to fight all of them just to keep her alive. Dawn broke over the ridge, pale light spilling across the mountains, soft and golden against the snow that lay crimson-streaked where Garrick had fought off the last of the intruders. Inside the cabin, the fire burned bright again, fed by Mara's steady hand, its crackle filling the silence that once ruled these walls. Garrick sat slumped on the bench, his arm bandaged where she had bound the wound with strips of her shawl, his face pale from blood lost, but his eyes fixed on her with a fierceness that made her chest ache. For the first time since she had stepped across his threshold, the weight of his solitude seemed to lift, as though the cabin itself had sighed in relief. Mara moved quietly, setting broth before him, the steam curling between them like a bridge. He took it, his scarred hands brushing hers. And for a long moment neither spoke, the silence no longer heavy with loneliness but with something waiting to be named. At last Garrick's voice broke, low and rough. 10 winters I swore I'd sleep alone, and 10 winters I kept my vow. But last night I fought like a man who had something to lose, and for the first time I was glad to lose my silence. Mara's throat tightened, tears welling in her eyes. And I walked into this storm because I had nothing left, she whispered, her voice trembling. But when you opened the door, Garrick, I found more than shelter. I found life again. He set aside the bowl, rising despite his wound, and stood over her, his towering frame no longer shadow but shield, his presence no longer terrifying but sacred. His hand lifted the wolf pelt from her shoulders and laid it across the bed by the hearth, his eyes never leaving hers. This cabin was a tomb, he said softly, but you've made it a home. Stay, Mara, stay, and these mountains will never break us. Her heart thundered as she stepped into his embrace, the warmth of his chest steady against her cheek, the storm outside nothing but memory. The fire flared, the wolf pelt lay spread as symbol of survival now shared, and the cabin that had known only silence at last breathed with life. Garrick's lips brushed her hair as he whispered, "No more winters alone." And Mara closed her eyes, knowing she had walked into a storm only to find a man who would fight the world to keep her warm. Please, like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If you had heard him say, "No more winters alone," would you have stepped inside that cabin too?